you know, the distinction between voiceless and voiced is important in English because it enables us to distinguish various pairs of consonants. Here we've got a screen with all of the various consonants of English between vowels, which is where we can observe this distinction most easily and readily. So we've got, first of all, these pairs of plosives: happy, hobby, city, ready, lucky, sugar. Pair of Africas: nature, magic. And then some pairs of fricatives: suffer, river, author, father, icy, easy, nation, measure. And in each case, on the left, we have the voiceless consonant. On the right, we have the voiced consonant. Now, the difference, you remember, between these is that in a voiceless consonant, the vocal folds are held wide apart, allowing the air to pass freely. Whereas during voiced consonants, the vocal folds vibrate. That is to say, they open and close rapidly, giving voice. So that's the distinction in the top pairs. Down at the bottom, we've got various other consonants of English which don't come in pairs, where we have just a single consonant and it's voiced. So we've got three nasals in the middle of hammer, honey, singer. We've got two liquids, sorry, follow, and we've got two semivowels, beyond, away. All of these are not members of pairs of voiceless and voiced. Now this basic presentation looks sort of very simple and straightforward. The complication in English lies in the details. Because the so-called voiced consonants are not, in fact, always very thoroughly voiced. The distinction between voiceless and voiced consonants is often carried by other things than strictly voicing. It's carried by aspiration, by the effects on vowel duration, which we saw with clipping, Phonetics clipping, and by things such as globalization, which reinforce this distinction. First of all, though, we need to make sure that we're fully in control of the voicing distinction. Fricatives here, top row, the voiceless ones: coffee, author, icy, mission. Bottom row, the voiced ones: cover, other, easy, vision. And here, the distinction really is one of voicing. We did a little practice in the first lecture. We can do another practice now of saying aloud fricatives and keeping everything the same, but switching the voicing on and off. So practicing like this. Everything stays the same except the voicing. And remember, you can check it by holding your thumb and forefinger to your larynx. And even more dramatically, by covering your ears with your hands. That's something you can easily use in the classroom with beginners when you're explaining difficult sounds, if there are any of them here. The bottom comment is for the benefit of Korean and perhaps Japanese students about saying easy and not making it into EG, which is a problem they have. Visit, again, has got a Z in the middle. In words such as visit, there should be voicing right through. Visit, visit, visit. What's wrong if I say, I will visit you? Visit, 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 visit. That's wrong. We've got a B for a V, and we've also got voiceless. If I correct the V, visit, 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 Spanish kind of mispronunciation, visit, visit, visit. Swedish kind of pronunciation, visit, visit, with voiceless instead of voice. Very quickly, more practice on voiced fricatives. You can make a long. We get double sometimes between words, as in with the father, with the father. Double long, double this, that, then smooth. More on z and j. He's busy. He's busy. He's busy. Not he's busy, but he's busy. He's busy. And to make a decision. Now, one of the difficulties in English is that almost all of our consonants can be found not only at the beginning of a word or a syllable, but also at the end. So here again we have all the consonants in order at the end of a word. Map, rub, again, so-called voicing distinction. Net, good, back, egg, and notice that they are different. Rough, love, fricatives, death, smooth, face, cheese, push, beige, rich, edge, affricates. And then the nasals come, pen, sing, and one liquid in my kind of English cell, because I wouldn't have final R in a word, at least not on its own. And again, the last few there don't have voiceless vowels. Well, it's time now to look a little bit more closely at what we mean when we say voiceless in a word such as pen. We have distinctions between pairs like pan and ban, town and down, come and gun. So the first thing we note is that we have to make them different. That's not a problem, I think, for most of you. It is a problem for certain language groups occasionally, but here there is a difference, and you must always make that difference. But what is it? When we take pan, the first one, notice that I don't pronounce it ban. Now, people with language background, French, Italian, Spanish, for example, might be tempted to say ban rather than pan. Down rather than town. Gun rather than come. What's wrong there? Well, it's that these are being pronounced without aspiration. Where we have pataka in this position in English, they are aspirated. That is to say, the plosive is followed by a brief puff of breath. Pan. Slowing it down. Pan. It's that puff of breath. Pan. I have a high-tech demonstration device here. Pan. Pan. If I mispronounce it, it might be ban. The French word for breakdown, if your car isn't working, être en panne, panne, panne. English word pan, pan, pan. That's that aspiration. Aspiration is only in certain positions. In some other positions, we do rely indeed just upon voiceless versus voiced. That's the case in the pair of words simple, symbol. They're the same, except that in simple, the voicing is switched off for a minute, simple. But in the other one, the voicing continues, simple, simple. Simple, simple. Again, this is easy for most of you, but not quite for everybody. Typical Danish mispronunciation would be to say simple for both of them. Simple, no difference. And when at the bottom we've got happy people, those should be voiceless stops in the middle of each word. Happy people. Danish mispronunciation. Happy people. With voicing in the wrong place. So, special little problems for certain groups. More people have difficulty keeping the contrast in final position. So we have various pairs of words in English such as cab and cab, where the difference is, again, voicing in the general sense. Cab, that's voiceless. Cab, well, it's sort of voiced. Here's what happens in Korean. I think actually there's a mistake in the Korean writing as well, where people don't have this contrast in final position, because in Korean, although you have final consonants, you don't have that sort of difference. Now, here's a schematic kind of diagram of what the vocal folds do. Where you see the straight line, that means the vocal folds are apart, the air can pass through freely. Where you see the jagged line, that means the vocal folds are vibrating. So there at the top is the diagram for the word happy. Happy. Now can you see, we start off for the first consonant, the H, with the vocal folds wide open, because H of course is voiceless. Then the voicing starts for the vowel, all vowels are voiced. Ha, ha, voicing comes on. Voicing switches off again for the consonant, ha, and then switches on again for the final vowel, happy. So the voicing is off, on, off, on. The human being is a remarkable machine. We are able, without thinking about it, to switch voicing on and off several times a second when we speak. Certainly it's what we're doing when we say happy. If you had the voicing on all the time, it would be happy. Happy, we don't say happy. If it were with the voicing off all the time, it would be, which we equally don't get. We say happy, and we've got this switching one way and the other. Happy, happy. Compare then hobby, hobby, where voicing switches on for the vowel and continues through the consonant. Hobby, hobby. If you like to try saying happy and hobby to yourselves aloud, again, you may be able to feel the difference in buzzing. Happy, 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 hobby, hobby, hobby. There is a real sense in which voiceless plosives consist of a moment's silence. What you hear in the middle of happy is a moment's silence. Happy. That silence is what tells you the consonant is there. Here is a similar diagram for two fricatives. Icy, easy. In the case of icy, the voicing switches on for the vowel, I, the diphthong, then switches off for the consonant, and then on again for the vowel, icy, 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 icy. In the case of easy, on the other hand, the voicing continues throughout without any interruption, because the whole thing requires voicing. Easy, easy, easy. And this kind of diagram might be helpful for Spanish or other learners who have a problem making this distinction. Icy, easy. Just return to this sheet. I said we have aspiration. Well, for that occur at the beginning. Head, tail, key, pan, town, come. We also get aspiration at the beginning of words such as praise, plot, tune, and quick. But here that aspiration has a particular effect. Instead of getting just a puff of breath after the vowel, han, we get praise. That period of voicelessness, that puff of breath, happens during the consonant, during the R in the case of praise. So the effect is a voiceless R. Praise, praise. In the case of plot, the aspiration happens during the L. So we get plot, 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 plot. In the case of tune, the aspiration happens during the yod, tune, tune, which of course is why it's easy for it then to become tune in some people's speech. In the case of quick, the aspiration happens during the W sound. Quick, 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 quick. So they're still aspirated, but we have to interpret aspiration not as a sort of extra segment, but as a delay in the start of voicing for the vowel. Those are cases of Pratica at the beginning of a word. Here are some more examples where we have to ask ourselves, do we get aspiration? What exactly is the rule about where you get aspiration in English? In a word such as depend, do we have aspiration? Let me try it. With aspiration, depend. Without aspiration, depend. Which sounds right? Depend. With aspiration. Depend. Depend. And not depend. Compare French dépendre. No aspiration. If I'm doing French correctly. Okay, so we do get aspiration in depend, attack, account, which tells us that the crucial environment for aspiration is not being at the beginning of a word, but more generally being at the beginning of a syllable, because clearly the syllable begins there with the consonant. So depend has aspiration, attack. In fact, the word attack, as spelled on the board, is pronounced exactly the same as if we have a small nail, which can be called a tack in English. And if I have a nail and I put it on a piece of paper, you could say the piece of paper is under attack, and it would be entirely ambiguous about the two kinds of attack. Okay. Now, what about the words police, today, collide? Do we get aspiration there? These examples of occur at the beginning of a word, but at the beginning of a weak syllable. Books will tell you different things about these, and it's possible that different varieties of English vary. I know I don't aspirate in this position. Police, 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 police. Perhaps a little tiny bit, but nothing like pan. Similarly, I say today, and not today. I say collide and not collide. So, I think what's crucial is to be at the beginning of a syllable that has a strong vowel. If you like, beginning of a stressed syllable, more generally. Now, what about these last two words here? Approve, accuse. The B and the K are at the beginning of a stressed syllable, which does have a strong vowel. But here the aspiration, again, takes the shape of devoicing the following consonant, the R or the Y. So when we say approve, approve, we get voiceless R, approve, approve, approve. And when we say accuse, 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 we get voiceless yod. That's the form the aspiration takes. Confusingly though, English PTK in some positions are very definitely unaspirated. And the most important position in which this applies is after S. So in a word such as spin, stand, school, the point being that we don't say spin, stand, school. The effect of the S is to remove the aspiration spin, stand, school. We know we get aspiration in pin, pin, not in bin, bin, and in spin, spin, not in spin. Scratch, strong. What does this tell us about the R sounds there? Scratch, strong. Well, of course, they're voiced. They don't have to undergo devoicing because of aspiration. I'm not saying they're 100% voiced. The voicing has got to switch on, but there's no reason for the voicing to delay. The voicing should come on as soon as the plosive consonant finishes. In the case of strong, you do tend to get an affricate and tr, so perhaps we can say the whole thing is voices there, but it's certainly not aspirated in the sense we were looking at before. What about the words lapse, depth, lots, fix? Here we've got voiceless plosives followed by a fricative. And the fricative is voiceless. Well, actually, it's a sort of silly question whether these plosives are aspirated. On the one hand, we certainly wouldn't say lapse, putting in a separate puff of breath before you come to the fricative. But on the other hand, aspiration perhaps is best seen as a delay in the start of voicing, delayed onset of voicing, and because there isn't any voicing to start in the case of these words, it's meaningless to ask whether it's delayed. Anyhow, they sound like unaspirated plosives, and this is important, for example, for Chinese learners, where in Chinese the distinction is made by aspiration, really, rather than by voicing. And it would sound strange, I think, if you were to make very aspirated plosives in these words. Same applies with the examples at the end, actor and captain. Now, in the sort of ordinary, relaxed English pronunciation of these words, notice what happens. Actor, actor, actor. We don't say actor, actor. We say actor. Equally, we don't say captain, captain. We say captain, captain. It's a fairly complicated sequence of events, really, because what we get is a kind of overlapping of the articulations of the two plosives. Now, all plosives consist of an approach phase during which the articulators, the place where it's made, move together. So the approach phase of a P is the lips coming together. The approach phase of a K is the back of the tongue rising into contact with the soft palate. Then we have a hold phase during which the air can't come through. And then we have a release phase during which the organs of speech move apart again. Well, this is then relevant when we think about a word like actor, because what typically happens is you have the approach phase for the velar, act. The air is then blocked, but while the velar closure is held, the tongue tip makes its movement and contacts the alveolar ridge, act. You can't hear that because there's no air behind it. Tongue tip makes its closure. Now the back of the tongue can be released. The air still can't escape because it's now held behind the tongue tip articulation. So we get act, K has turned into T, you can't hear it. And finally, the tongue tip is released and the vowel follows, actor. And really what you can see on spectrograms and so on, physical measurements of this, we can see the effects of the velar onset to this silence. So we know it's a velar beginning, act. Then we have a long silence, act.
And then we have an alveolar offset, so we know that it was alveolar as well. Actor, actor, but a long silence between them. Similarly with captain. I don't know how important this is for EFL purposes, because if you say actor and captain, we can certainly understand. But it's a very careful, very special pronunciation for us. The everyday one is actor, captain. Okay, we found aspiration at the beginning of stressed syllables. No aspiration after S. There are a number of other positions where we tend to get something intermediate. Now, first of all, I say, at the end of words, you might think it's pretty meaningless to ask about aspiration if aspiration is delayed onset of voicing. But words don't occur in isolation. Words occur in the middle of sentences, utterances, and so we can ask if one of these words like ripe, or shut, or look is followed by another word that begins with a vowel, what happens? If we've got a ripe apple, is that P aspirated? Ripe apple, ripe apple. Well, not really. We don't say a ripe apple. We say a ripe apple. It's not absolutely unaspirated, perhaps, a little bit, but it's not really aspirated in the sense that the initial ones are. Shut out, shut away, shut away, shut away, shut away. Do I say shut away, aspiration? No. Do I say shut away, no aspiration? Well, I can do, and of course what the Americans do, and sometimes British people as well, is not only have no aspiration, but allow the voicing to continue, shut away. And that can happen, of course, because this is a position where you don't get aspiration. It wouldn't be able to happen in a position where aspiration is expected. Look out, same thing there, unaspirated or perhaps slightly aspirated. That's then true of the medial P in happy, letter, lucky, and so on. Interestingly enough, it also seems to be the case even after S at the ends of words like wasp. There's a wasp out there. In the middle of words like resting. Not quite as unaspirated as in sting. Oscar, lifted, all of these being after a fricative in the middle. And we've already looked at the case of words like tomorrow, today. So summing up, the rule is as given at 3 on your handout. We can say that English PTK are aspirated when at the beginning of a syllable if it has a strong vowel. They're unaspirated when preceded by S in this position, or when they're followed by S or some other obstruent, words like fix. And in the remaining positions, elsewhere, that's this lot, unaspirated or slightly aspirated. Well, so much for the details of English. Let's just look more generally at what we mean by aspiration. As I've been hinting, really what aspiration is a delay in the start of voicing. If this line represents the moment when the lips come apart, time along here, if we have a very big delay, that's heavy aspiration. So, ha, ha, ha. Not quite such a big delay. Ha, ha, ha. That's English style aspiration. Ha. There's still ha, ha. That's perhaps a slight aspiration. No aspiration. Pa, pa, pa. If the voicing starts before the lips separate, then we've got some pre-voicing. Ba, ba, ba. Or, of course, the voicing may go all the way through. Ba, ba. Or indeed from before the closure, a ba, a ba, a ba. And this is a continuum. This is not a sequence of absolutely discrete steps. This is a continuum of possibilities. Different languages make different use of this continuum of possibilities. In French, Italian, Spanish, you really only exploit the bottom end here. And so you have a ba, da, ga, and a ba, da, ga, or ba, da, da. In Chinese, you exploit the top end of here. We have pa, ta, and we have ba, da, but we don't really have ba, da. In Thai, spoken in Thailand, they have three possibilities. They have ta, da, da, all three being different. Ta, aspirated, da, unaspirated but voiceless, da, voiced. So you see, different languages exploit this in different ways. And this can help us to see what happens in English in some cases about voiced consonants. Here's an example of a word, good, that begins and ends with plosives which we conventionally refer to as voiced. But that doesn't mean that we normally say such a word with voicing throughout. If I did that with voicing all the way through, it would be good, good, good. Not impossible, but it's not the way we usually say it. We normally say good, good, good. Now, this is because of the effects of the silence before and after. During silence, when you're saying nothing, the vocal folds, of course, are open. And it's like gradually getting yourself geared up into work. It doesn't happen instantaneously. It takes a moment to get the vocal folds working. Similarly, they know afterwards they're going to have to stop, and they anticipate this a bit. So we can say that silence smears into voicing. We get this initial and final tendency to devoice. Good, good. It's very dramatically seen on a spectrogram, and people who've been expecting to see full voicing in so-called voice consonants are often surprised and perhaps dismayed when they inspect a real spectrogram. This isn't a real spectrogram, this is a schematic diagram, but it shows the point. But in a word like good, it does in fact depend, if it's in the middle of a sentence, on what the surrounding words are. If the surrounding sounds are voiceless, then this has the same effect as pause, as silence. So if we have the phrase, this good sign, the s of this is voiceless, so there's a delay in starting the voicing for good. And the s of sign is also voiceless, so the voicing switches off quite early. This good sign. On the other hand, if we have a good idea, now there it's surrounded by words which have voicing. Vowel, voiced. Idea begins with a vowel, voiced. So a good idea, voicing will normally continue throughout the whole thing, because it's not a matter of switching it on or switching it off, it's just a matter of keeping it going. A good idea. Reverting to this good, notice that in some languages, when you have voiceless S followed by a voiced something, in some languages there's a tendency to assimilate voicing. And therefore, for a phrase like this good, to say this good, we don't do that in English. So, if your language is French or Dutch or one of the Slavonic languages that does have this tendency, please note that we don't say it in English. It's striking in words like textbook. Text, voiceless, book, voiced. Mispronunciation, textbook, textbook, textbook. Correct pronunciation, textbook, textbook, textbook. English keeps voiceless sounds voiceless. Just have a look for a moment at the handout sheet. Point 5. The voiced linis obstruents, but the g, j, are reliably voiced only when between other voiced sounds. That's what we had in a good idea. If they're not between voiced sounds, elsewhere then, they're usually devoiced. That is, there's little or no actual vibration of the vocal folds during their production. This is really why we often use these terms linis and fortis, because we got embarrassed about saying voiced and voiceless because we know it's not actually quite true. So the terms linis and fortis can be defined in a more general way so that they are true. Why doesn't a devoiced linis, though, sound like a fortis if you take away the voicing from d? Why doesn't it sound like t? Well, obviously one reason is because it doesn't have aspiration. And indeed in English, it's probably the case that aspiration counts much more than actual voicing in knowing which sound is involved. If we've got a word like pin and bin, and we play to native speakers some kind of intermediate thing that doesn't have voicing but doesn't have aspiration, they tend to hear it as being the B voiced one, because we react to lack of aspiration. Well, so that's one. We've also seen the effects of clipping, pre-fortis clipping, which we get before a fortis consonant, that's a voiceless one, but not, of course, before a voiced one. That's a linis one, not necessarily fully voiced. Which means that if we have a word like rub, 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 we don't have to say it with full voicing. It wouldn't be normal to say rub, rub, but rub, rub. How do we know it isn't a P? Well, you don't get the clipping effect on the vowel. There isn't the word rub, but there might be. If we take bad, how is bad different from bat? Bat has a shorter vowel because it's clipped before the T. Bad is rather longer. Bat may have a bit of this aspiration at the end. None at all, of course, in the case of B. The third bullet point under 5 refers to something which I believe to be true, but which hasn't altogether been demonstrated yet in the laboratory. Well, everybody agrees that the linis consonants seem to have less articulatory force. If we take the word touch, that ends in ch, touch, and compare with it the word judge, judge, which ends in the linis, you can perhaps easily detect the forcefulness of the ch in touch, ch, 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 compared with the lack of force of the j in judge. It isn't actually voiced, okay, but it isn't ch, it's. And this is one of the things that is being referred to really when we say linis is relatively weak force. How do we get this reduction in forcefulness? Well, I think that the probable reason is that the vocal folds in a devoiced linis like this are not actually wide open as they are in proper voiceless sounds, but they're in the narrowed whisper position. Now, is voiceless, is whisper. Can you hear the difference? Voicing, voiceless. Whisper. In fact, when you whisper like this, you replace the voiced sounds with whispered sounds, and the voiceless ones remain voiceless. And even in whispering, we can hear the difference. We can hear the difference between pin and bin. That's between pin and bin. So we're relying on something else. You are able to perceive that difference in aspiration plus difference in forcefulness. So that's this less articulatory force that does seem to be the crucial and constant ingredient of the Linus series when compared with the Fortis series. Well, we've covered the various points we need to cover about voicing and aspiration. What I've had to say, of course, is in a sense annoying, because we started with a nice simple definition, voiceless versus voiced, and we've now complicated it by bringing in aspiration, seeing that, well, even aspiration doesn't always apply, and sometimes voiced things aren't really voiced, and we get these effects of the context. Then we've got articulatory force. Nevertheless, the starting point is correct from the linguistic point of view, because linguistically we have to distinguish between one set and the other set, and that's the most important thing. Notice that in the position after S, where we saw there was no aspiration, spin, this is also a position where there's no actual contrast of voicing. Although we distinguish pin from bin, we don't distinguish spin from any other candidate. We could write it with a B, S-B-I-N, and it wouldn't cause confusion. So in a sense, the phonetic facts parallel the linguistic facts. At the bottom of the sheet, point 6, I've listed some of the particular kinds of problem that I'm aware of, depending on language and so on. Interference from the first language. So first of all, some languages don't really have any voiced obstruents. Chinese, for example, which doesn't matter too much as long as you keep them Linus, but it's possibly worthwhile practicing making them voiced between vowels. Words like labour, meter, bo, which should be voiced throughout rather than labour. Second bullet point, gemination. I haven't really talked about gemination. Gemination is double consonants. Although we write two letters P in the word happy, we don't say happy. We say happy, single quick consonant. However, many Japanese learners, when the P is at the end of a word, or the end of a morpheme, tend to make it too long and sort of doubled. So instead of saying shop, we get shop, shop, with an extra long P, and instead of going shopping, going shopping. That's not appropriate, so we have to reduce it in duration to a single type of P. Aspiration, well, we've already noted that various languages don't have aspiration, so they may have to practice doing aspiration, pin, tin. Some other languages perhaps have rather too much aspiration, because they're at the top of that continuum diagram I showed you, rather than one stage below the top. Koreans have very heavy aspiration, and it's not appropriate in English to say pin rather than pin, just a bit of aspiration. Failure to distinguish the fricatives from one another, particularly s, which is a problem for Spanish and for the Scandinavian languages. And a general problem with making the contrast of voicing in positions other than initial, so in the middle of a word, simple symbol, or at the end of a word, bat, bag. And that can be a problem for those whose languages don't have consonants in those positions, or don't have the distinction of voicing in that position. It's also a problem with speakers of German, Polish, Russian, and so on, but on the whole, in my experience, that is well taught in schools, so that at my level I never come across speakers of those languages who can't make this distinction in final position, whereas I do sometimes for some other languages. And with that, we've got to the end of voicing and aspiration, and it's time for you to go to your practical classes.